They bullied the quiet guy at the high-stakes auction, laughing as they poured expensive red wine over his tattooed hands to clean the street off him. They had no idea the man they were mocking was the Black Korean boss signing their fate on a $950 million acquisition. Phones recorded every sneer, and whispers of thug spread through the elite crowd. Something shifted in his eyes as he walked out without a word, and the fallout started before they even realized he had moved. Before we reveal the moment the gavel dropped and their world ended, hit that subscribe button. Your support helps us bring you more stories where power flips in a single moment. Now, let's begin. The heavy oak doors of the Metropolitan Auction House swung open, admitting a draft of cool night air and Isaiah Choi. He didn't enter with the practiced swagger of the men already inside. He moved with a predatory stillness that seemed to swallow the light. His midnight navy suit was so dark it appeared like a bruise against the shimmering backdrop of the ballroom, a bespoke cut that hugged a frame built for more than just sitting behind a desk. Inside, the circle was in full swing. It was a sea of champagne silk and gold-threaded wool, a collective of people who spent their lives looking over the heads of anyone they deemed lesser. As Isaiah moved through the foyer, the air around him chilled. To anyone else, he looked regal, his deep-toned skin contrasting sharply with the crisp white of his collar. But to the circle, he was a glitch in the software. "Is that a guest, or did the valet lose his way?" Ryan Blake's voice carried over the soft hum of a string quartet, dripping with a manufactured charm that hid a jagged edge. He nudged Thomas Cross, who adjusted his gold cufflinks with a rhythmic, nervous tick. Thomas didn't even look up, probably looking for the service entrance. Security is getting sloppy. Isaiah heard them. He heard the muffled giggles of the women behind lace fans and the rhythmic clinking of crystal flutes being tilted away from him as he passed. He was an island of silence in a room full of noise. He walked toward the center of the hall, his eyes, heavy-lidded and sharp, scanning the faces of the people he was about to either enrich or destroy. He didn't defend himself. He didn't reach into his pocket to flash a VIP pass or a black card. He simply stood near a fluted marble pillar, his monolid gaze fixed on the podium where the $950 million deed sat waiting. "Look at those hands," Madeline Cross whispered, her voice a sharp blade wrapped in velvet. She stood just a few feet away, her ice-blue dress catching the light like a glacier. She stared at the black ink of the dragon tattoo peeking out from Isaiah's cuff, her lip curling in a polished sneer. Imagine having the audacity to bring street ink into a room of this caliber. He hasn't said a word because he probably doesn't know which fork to use, let alone how to bid. The circle tightened around their own, physically leaning away from Isaiah as if his quietness were contagious. They mocked his silence, misinterpreting his lack of chatter for a lack of intelligence, and his lack of jewelry for a lack of means. Isaiah Choi remained the invisible king, watching the people who thought they were the judges of the world, unaware that he was the only one in the room currently holding the gavel. The air in the auction hall was thick with the scent of lilies and expensive cologne, a fragrance that seemed to sour as Madeline Cross turned her attention fully toward the man leaning against the marble pillar. She didn't whisper this time. Her voice was a calculated strike, projected just loud enough to ripple through the nearby clusters of the elite. "I truly don't understand the lack of standards tonight," she remarked, her blood-red lips curling into a look of sheer physical revulsion. She gestured vaguely with a gloved hand toward Isaiah, though she refused to meet his eyes. "We are here to bid on the city's heritage, yet the management allows the room to be cluttered with this. It's a total shift in the vibe. One shouldn't have to check their pockets for their wallet while attending a billion-dollar acquisition." A few feet away, Thomas Cross offered a dry, dismissive chuckle, adjusting his pinstriped lapels as if to shield himself from Isaiah's presence. "It's a symptom of the times, Madeline. People think a dark suit and a silent tongue can buy them entry into rooms they haven't earned. But some things are etched in the skin." He shot a pointed look at the dragon ink visible on Isaiah's neck. "That man looks like he belongs in a high-security jail cell, not standing on the floor of a prestigious estate. It's an insult to everyone who actually has a seat at the table." The circle shifted in unison, a synchronized dance of exclusion. They formed a physical barrier, a wall of gold and champagne-toned backs that cordoned Isaiah off into his own private exile. Ryan Blake joined the huddle, his grin wide and predatory. "Maybe he's the help, Thomas, though I wouldn't even trust him to park my car with those hands. He's probably just here for the free air conditioning." Isaiah remained as still as a statue, his monolid eyes fixed on the velvet-draped podium. He didn't flinch, didn't redden, and didn't offer the satisfaction of a defense. He simply observed the way Madeline's diamond brooch rose and fell with her haughty breaths, noting the exact frequency of their arrogance. To them, he was a social stain, a visual error in their perfect world. They were so busy building a wall to keep him out that they failed to realize he was the one who already owned the land they were standing on. He wasn't trapped outside their circle. He was simply waiting for the moment he would decide to close it. The lights in the grand hall dimmed slightly as the auctioneer took the stage, his voice cutting through the perfumed air with the sharp crack of a gavel. The first few items were appetizers for the wealthy, minor artifacts and decorative trinkets meant to warm up the room's bidding muscles before the $950 million main event. When a small, antique celadon vase was brought to the podium, Ryan Blake saw his opportunity to transform the auction into a theater of cruelty. With a theatrical flourish, Ryan raised his paddle, a smirk stretching across his face as he locked eyes with Isaiah. "5,000, Ryan announced, his voice carrying an unnecessary volume. He leaned closer to Isaiah, the smell of expensive bourbon trailing off him. "That's probably a year's rent for a guy like you, isn't it? Don't worry, it gets more expensive from here." Isaiah didn't move. He stood with his hands loosely clasped behind his back, his posture as unshakable as a mountain. His silence seemed to irritate Ryan more than a retort would have. The circle shifted closer, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the auction screens, waiting for the punchline. "What's the matter, tough guy? Lost your voice along with your bank account?" Ryan laughed, a sharp, barking sound that drew several eyes from the front rows. He waved his paddle dismissively toward the podium. "Going once, going twice. Oh, look at that. I just bought a piece of history while you're just taking up space. You really should try to keep up, Isaiah. It's embarrassing to watch someone just stand there while the world moves on without them." Madeline Cross tilted her head, her sapphire brooch glinting like a predatory eye. "He can't keep up, Ryan. Bidding requires credit, and I doubt he's ever seen a number with more than 3 zeros that wasn't on a police report." Thomas Cross joined in, his scowl deepening as he adjusted his gold tie bar. The silence is actually quite fitting. It's the sound of someone realizing they've walked into a room where they simply don't exist. Isaiah remained an island of stillness amidst their rising tide of mockery. He watched as the celadon vase was marked as sold to Ryan, a triviality in the grand scheme of the evening. To Ryan, it was a victory. To Isaiah, it was just another data point in the moral bankruptcy of the people surrounding him. He didn't need to bid on a vase to prove his presence. He was waiting for the moment when the only thing left to bid on would be their survival. And by then, the price would be far higher than any of them could afford. The auctioneer moved on to a series of rare manuscripts, but the atmosphere in the back of the hall remained thick with a different kind of tension. Isaiah reached out toward a passing attendant to take a leather-bound catalog, his movement fluid and deliberate. As his arm extended, the crisp white cuff of his shirt retreated, and the midnight navy sleeve of his suit shifted just enough to expose the truth he had been carrying in silence. The light from the overhead chandeliers caught the deep saturation of the ink. A meticulously detailed dragon coiled around his wrist, its scales intertwining with the delicate, sharp lines of a Korean hibiscus. It was a masterpiece of shadow and skin, a visual testament to a life lived in the trenches of power that the circle could never comprehend. Ryan Blake's eyes widened, then crinkled with a newfound, malicious delight. He leaned in, his shoulder nearly brushing Isaiah, his voice carrying that high, nasal tone of someone who had never known a day of true consequence. "Well, look at that. The mystery solved. I knew the suit looked like a rental, but the ink, that confirms it." He gestured wildly toward Isaiah's hand, drawing the attention of Madeline and Thomas Cross. "We've got a real live thug with a budget among us, everyone. Tell me, Isaiah, did you have to rob a bank to afford the entry fee, or is that suit just a cover for the ankle monitor we can't see?" Madeline recoiled, her architectural white dress rustling like dry parchment. She pressed a hand to her sapphire brooch as if shielding herself from a contagion. "It's worse than I thought," she hissed, her winged eyeliner sharp as a talon. "It's one thing to be poor, but to be marked. It's barbaric. To think we're breathing the same air as a street criminal while trying to conduct a billion-dollar legacy deal." Thomas Cross stepped forward, his scowl deepening into a look of bureaucratic disgust. He adjusted his gold tie bar, his fingers trembling slightly not from fear, but from the sheer offense of Isaiah's existence. "You've made a mockery of this institution just by walking through the doors," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a low, cold vibration. "Tattoos like that belong in the docks or the dark alleys of Seoul, not in the presence of the Cross family. You're a stain on the carpet, boy." Isaiah didn't pull his sleeve back down. He allowed the ink to remain visible, a dark contrast against the white linen, looking at his own hand as if observing a weapon he hadn't yet decided to use. He didn't offer a name, a rank, or a threat. He simply turned his gaze back to the catalog, his monolid eyes scanning the crown jewel listing with a terrifying focus. The circle continued to laugh, fueled by Ryan's mocking commentary, entirely unaware that the thug they were disparaging was currently the only person in the room with the capital to buy their entire world and burn it for the insurance money. The tension in the hall reached a fever pitch as the auctioneer paused to prepare the final lot, leaving a heavy silence that Ryan Blake was all too eager to fill. He swirled the deep red liquid in his crystal glass, the vintage Cabernet catching the light like a pool of fresh blood. With a predatory glance toward Madeline and Thomas, who watched with expectant, cruel grins, Ryan stepped directly into Isaiah's path. "You know, Isaiah, there's a persistent smell of the gutter in this corner," Ryan said, his voice ringing out with a jagged, mocking clarity. "I think it's coming from that ink. It's a shame, really. Such a nice suit, yet it's being worn by someone who still carries the dirt of the pavement on his skin." Isaiah didn't move. He stood with his tattooed hands at his sides, his expression as unreadable as the dark water of a deep well. The circle began to close in, their champagne flutes held like scepters, their faces illuminated by the golden glow of the chandeliers. They were a wall of silk and judgment, waiting for the climax of the night's entertainment. "Allow me to help you," Ryan sneered. "A little ritual to wash away the street before the real business begins." With a slow, deliberate tilt of his wrist, Ryan inverted the glass. The heavy red wine cascaded downward, a dark, staining waterfall that splashed directly over Isaiah's knuckles. The liquid soaked into the intricate lines of the dragon and the hibiscus, drenching the white linen of his cuffs and seeping into the midnight navy fabric of his sleeve. The red droplets splattered against the polished marble floor, sounding like heavy rain in the sudden, breathless silence of the room. A wave of high-pitched laughter rippled through the circle. Madeline Cross pressed a lace handkerchief to her lips, her eyes dancing with couture cruelty as she watched the wine ruin the silent man's dignity. Ryan stood back, his toothy grin wide and empty. "There, now you look a little more like the mess you are." Thomas Cross adjusted his gold tie bar, a look of profound satisfaction settling over his tired features. "Consider it a baptism, boy. You were never one of us, and now everyone can see the stain." Isaiah remained perfectly still. He didn't wipe the wine away, nor did he ball his fists. He simply looked down at his hands, watching the red liquid drip from the tip of his dragon-inked thumb. The hum of the room returned, louder and more aggressive now that the thug had been put in his place. They had seen the red baptism, and in their arrogance, they believed they had just witnessed a man's defeat. They were so busy congratulating Ryan that they failed to notice the cold, glacial shift in Isaiah's monolid eyes. A look that suggested he wasn't just counting the drops of wine, but the minutes left before he ended their world. The silence that followed the wine's splash was more deafening than the laughter. Isaiah Choi stood like a monolith of midnight and ink, the dark Cabernet dripping from his fingers and pooling around his polished shoes. He didn't explode in a rage. He didn't even look at Ryan Blake. Instead, he raised his hand slowly, his monolid eyes fixed on a single, stubborn drop of red trembling on the head of the inked dragon. With a calm that bordered on the supernatural, he took a silk handkerchief from his pocket, wiped that lone drop away with surgical precision, and dropped the stained cloth onto the marble floor. He turned his back on the circle, his movements as fluid and controlled as a shadow retreating from the sun. The sound of his footsteps was the only rhythm in the room, steady and unhurried. He didn't look back at the $950 million estate deed on the podium, nor did he acknowledge the 100 pairs of eyes tracking his exit. He moved toward the heavy oak doors, a ghost leaving a haunted house. "That's right, keep walking," Thomas Cross called out, his voice booming with the false bravado of a man who thought he had won a war he hadn't even started. He adjusted his gold tie bar, looking around at the elite crowd for approval, his face twisted in a sneer of pure bureaucratic disgust. "Good riddance to trash. Some people need to learn that you can't buy class with a stolen suit and a criminal record." Madeline Cross leaned into Thomas's shoulder, her sapphire brooch catching the light as she watched Isaiah's retreating figure. "He finally realized he was suffocating in a room full of oxygen," she whispered, her sharp eyeliner glinting. Ryan Blake let out a final, barking laugh, raising his empty glass in a mock toast to the closed doors. "The trash took itself out. Now, can we finally get back to the real money?" The circle closed the gap where Isaiah had stood, their golden and champagne silhouettes merging back into a solid wall of arrogance. They returned to their chatter, their jokes, and their planning for a future they believed was guaranteed. They felt lighter, cleansed of the thug who had dared to stand among them. They were so busy celebrating their social victory that they didn't see the flicker of the auction house lights or the frantic vibration of the auctioneer's tablet. They didn't realize that Isaiah Choi hadn't left because he was defeated. He had left because he no longer needed to be a witness. The ghost had vanished, and in his wake, he had left a vacuum that was about to swallow the Cross Empire whole. The auctioneer's voice took on a frantic, rhythmic edge as the main event finally hit the floor. This was the crown jewel, a legacy acquisition that represented the final lifeline for the Cross family. Thomas Cross stood tall, his chest puffed out with a desperate sort of pride, raising his paddle with a hand that shook only slightly. The bidding climbed with a dizzying, brutal speed, leaping from 500 million to 700, then 800, shedding the smaller players until only the Crosses remained at the summit. 850 million, Thomas barked, the sound of a man betting his last breath. He looked around the room, his eyes searching for a challenger, but the circle remained silent, their faces filled with a reverent awe. Madeline gripped his arm, her red-lipped smile widening into a mask of triumph. They had done it. They had survived the scandal of the thug and were seconds away from cementing their status forever. "Going once at 850, the auctioneer intoned, his gavel hovering like an executioner's blade. "Going twice." Suddenly, a sharp, electronic chime echoed through the hall, a sound so digital and modern it felt like a gunshot in the antique room. The massive LED screen behind the podium flickered. The number $850 million vanished, replaced by a staggering, cold $950 million. The room went ice cold. It wasn't just a bid, it was a ceiling, a total, overwhelming shutdown of the competition. Thomas's face went from a flush of victory to a ghostly, sickly gray. He jerked his paddle upward, but the auctioneer was staring at his tablet with wide, unblinking eyes. I have a digital bid," the man stammered, his professional composure shattering. "An anonymous overseas syndicate, $950 million. "That's impossible," Madeline shrieked, her hand flying to her sapphire brooch as if it could save her. "Check the credentials. Who has that kind of liquidity?" The auctioneer didn't even look at her. His eyes were fixed on the confirmation code on his screen, a sequence that bypassed every credit check in the building. "The funds are—" "They are already verified. It's a total buyout. No contingencies." He brought the gavel down with a finality that felt like a tombstone being slid into place. "Crack. Sold," he whispered, "to the primary shareholder of the Kang-Choi Global Group." The circle, once a wall of gold and laughter, was now a sea of frozen statues. Ryan Blake's glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the marble, but no one turned to look. A heavy, suffocating realization began to settle over the room. The Crosses hadn't just lost a house, they had lost the war. And as the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall began to creak open once more, the air didn't just feel cold, it felt like the presence of a king. The heavy oak doors didn't just open, they surrendered. Isaiah Choi stepped back into the hall, and the atmosphere didn't just shift, it collapsed. He had stripped away the midnight navy jacket, leaving him in a stark white dress shirt with sleeves rolled precisely to the elbows. The red wine stain was still there, a jagged, blooming scar of crimson against the pristine linen of his right cuff, but it no longer looked like a mark of humiliation. It looked like a battle standard. The silence that gripped the circle was absolute. It was the kind of silence that precedes a landslide. As Isaiah moved down the center aisle, the elite crowd parted like a retreating tide, their golden silhouettes shrinking into the shadows. Gone was the invisible king. In his place was a man whose every step vibrated with the weight of $1 trillion empire. The auctioneer, a man who had spent his career catering to the whims of the Crosses and their ilk, did something the room had never seen. He stepped down from his elevated podium, his head bowed in a deep, traditional gesture of subservience. He didn't offer a greeting, he offered a pen. Isaiah didn't look at Madeline, whose mouth hung open in a silent, horrified gasp, nor did he look at Thomas, whose knees had visibly buckled. He climbed the stairs to the podium with a rhythmic, terrifying grace. The crown jewel, deed lay waiting on the velvet, a document that represented the literal ground the Crosses stood upon. With a movement that was slow and deliberate, Isaiah reached out. His right hand, the one Ryan Blake had tried to baptize with mockery, hovered over the parchment. The black ink of the dragon tattoo on his knuckles was still damp with the residue of the Cabernet, shimmering under the intense heat of the spotlights. He gripped the pen, and as he pressed the nib to the paper, the wine-stained cuff of his sleeve brushed against the legal document, leaving a faint, pink smear across the gold leaf border. He signed his name, Isaiah Choi, in a sharp, authoritative script that slashed across the page. It was more than a signature. It was a claim. The scratch of the pen on the heavy vellum was the only sound in the room, a final, rhythmic execution of the Cross family's relevance. He laid the pen down and finally turned his head, his monolid eyes locking onto Madeline with a cold, terrifying clarity. He didn't need to shout to be heard. The wine on his hand had dried, but the power it represented was just beginning to burn. He had signed their fate with the very stain they had given him, and the room finally understood that the thug hadn't just bought a house, he had bought them. Isaiah stood at the podium, the signed deed beneath his wine-stained hand, looking down at the wreckage of the Cross dynasty. The air in the room had turned thin, a vacuum where their arrogance used to be. Madeline's face was a cracked mask of porcelain, her sharp eyeliner now highlighting eyes wide with a primal, dawning terror. Thomas looked as though his bones had turned to glass, his hand clutching his gold tie bar as if it were a life preserver in a sinking ship. Isaiah didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He tapped a single command into the tablet provided by the auctioneer, his movements clinical and cold. "Thomas," he said, his voice a low, melodic vibration that cut through the silence. "I just took a look at the books for the Cross Group. Your debt is held by my syndicate. As of 5 seconds ago, I've frozen your corporate lines. Every account, every credit facility, every cent you thought you had to your name. It's gone." A collective gasp rippled through the circle, but Isaiah's gaze remained fixed on the couple. "You said I didn't belong in this room. You were right. This room is too small." He turned to the head of security, a man who only minutes ago had been ready to toss Isaiah into the street. "Clear the hall, starting with the Crosses and Mr. Blake. They are no longer on the guest list of a property I own." The irony was a physical weight. Security guards, moving with a sudden, panicked efficiency, stepped forward. They didn't offer a polite request. They placed their hands on Thomas's pinstriped shoulders and gripped Madeline's silk-covered arms. Ryan Blake tried to stammer a protest, his toothy grin replaced by a trembling lip, but he was shoved toward the exit without a second glance. The circle watched in a state of paralyzed shock as their leaders were marched toward the heavy oak doors. As they reached the threshold, the doors swung open to reveal a relentless, driving rainstorm. It was the same cold, unforgiving night Isaiah had entered from, but now it was waiting to swallow them. Madeline looked back one last time. Her ice-blue dress soaked the moment she hit the pavement, her sapphire brooch reflecting nothing but the dark. Isaiah watched them go, standing exactly where he had stood before, but now the light belonged to him. They were escorted into the downpour, their designer heels splashing into the same gutters they had accused him of inhabiting. As the doors began to close, mirroring his own silent exit from an hour ago, Isaiah Choi picked up a fresh glass of water. He didn't celebrate. He simply watched the doors lock, leaving the crosses in the rain and the world in his hands.